It was Good Friday. The streets were open and empty. Do you remember the feeling when we were young? This week? For a long time I've tried to say to myself that Easter particularly had no more meaning for me. That Easter was nothing. That Good Friday was nothing. In Ireland, there was a game. It was one of the only days of the year when pubs were not allowed to open, and so people would come up with the most hilarious solutions. Parties at golf clubs, private house parties, of a level of debauchery that could only have been fueled by blasphemy, by transgression. We enjoyed the fact that we were spitting in the face of the austerity and the denial that we had once lived. As children, this was a strange time. That arid stretch of Lent leading to that sudden intensity, mounting intensity of different church services throughout Holy Week, culminating, of course, on Good Friday with the Passion Play. Then Easter Sunday, celebration of the resurrection. I said to myself, these things no longer mean anything to me. They are not mine. They were imposed upon me. They are a glorification of suffering and martyrdom and torture. They are repugnant. And even as I came to find Christmas later more acceptable, and to realize that that midwinter festival remained meaningful, and that the gifts and the Santa Claus myth was something that I could share with my children, and that it had a magic that I couldn't deny, and that the story of the Nativity too, that story still speaks deeply. The story of the isolated family lost in the night, the poor, houseless wretches, travellers in the depths of winter, finding home and hearth in the most lowly of shelters, and the hope that does spring eternal with each new birth of each new child. That is undeniable, and there is something universal and something, a kind of a mystical experience of Christmas, and also of the songs, the carols, the music, the traditions, all of those things. They didn't seem to me to be tied so much to the dogma as to be just a celebration of the hope of the spark of life in the dark, in the midst of winter. But Easter, no, I didn't want to have any part of that. Now occasionally, of course, I mean, this imagery, this dogma, this set of symbols are deeply ingrained in me, in Western European culture, in my way of seeing the world and understanding the world. And when I would become conscious of them, of course, I would try to handle them with irony. I would try to handle the Christic imagery, if I ever found myself playing into it, with humour. And it pleased me also to tell jokes that would have been at one time seen as blasphemous, sacrilegious, because there was still a little thrill of transgression, you know. One of our favourites was the one of the Last Supper, and Jesus saying to the disciples, "Even now, one of you will betray me." And Peter says, "Surely not I, Lord." He says, "No, not you, Peter." And John says, "Surely not I, Lord." And he says, "No, not you, John." And they go all the way around. And then he gets to Judas, and Judas says, "Surely not I, Lord." And he says, "Surely not I, Lord." And that gets a laugh from me still. Every time I tell it, I laugh at it, let alone other people laughing at it. But it just occurs to me, especially this year, a few things have brought it to mind. And this idea of what do we do now with Christian stories, especially when it comes to our children. My children are not baptized, but I know that there are those of my siblings, some of those of my siblings, some of those of my cousins, of my friends. You know, baptism is still a powerful thing as a rite of passage, passage into the world, into community, a ceremony of naming. And unfortunately, we didn't think of doing it in a more secular or even a more pagan way with our own children. We were diffident about that. I think it's hard to create your own traditions and to ask other people to adhere to them or to be implicated, And there is still something very powerful about the ceremony of baptism. The pouring water on the child's head and baptizing them with the chrism, the oil, and lighting the candle, all of those things. So I absolutely get why people still do it. Even the people who don't necessarily believe 100%, I see why they do, and I've been a godfather at those ceremonies more than once. And I've told the people who've given me the honour of inviting me to be a godfather, I've said to them, what, not only do I not practice Catholicism anymore, I don't believe in it. In fact, in some ways I hate it. And they said, that's okay. We just want you to be an influence in this child's life. And like I said, I was very honoured, and I did, I just held my tongue when the vows I did not believe in were asked of me, except, of course, the one, do you reject Satan and all his works? And under my breath I said, oh, I don't know, I kind of like some of his early stuff. But it is interesting to think to yourself, in a secular society, which in Europe we have, more or less, in a secular society, or even in the context of parents who are spiritual in other ways, who are pagan animists, for example, what is the place of Christian stories? Do we still tell them? I mean, because it seems to me that it can be important to know them. I know that certainly I was doing qualifying exams in literature in France some years ago, and on our program was Everyman, which is a medieval miracle play, or mystery play, miracle play, morality play, that's it, morality play. I was getting confused, but and in Everyman, he's talking to personifications of vices and virtues and so on like that, and you need to know a little bit of Christian theology to understand the play. And it was funny because I found that I was one of the only ones in my whole cohort who had a little bit of the background that would enable me to understand concepts of salvation, references to the Bible, and so on. And I have later in my in my career as a literature teacher, I have taught parts of the Bible as literature, and that's actually fascinating to do. I taught Genesis in a course on gender. It was called Masculine Feminine, and that was fascinating. How has Genesis contributed to our understanding of masculinity and femininity in the modern sort of Western European world? And it absolutely has. Or, I found myself going back to Bible texts, not for the theology, but rather for the poetry, particularly the King James Version, rereading parts of the Song of Songs or Ecclesiastes, rereading parts of the New Testament or the letters of the Apostles, and finding that these things live in that substrate of language and poetry in which we swim. And not only that, but because they talk about some of the more mystical sides of our experience, they still do provide us with a language, or at least it's not that they provide us, it's that they are de facto part of the language that we have to approach the divine and to approach the mysteries. And I think, like a lot of people in different contexts, I was very angry for a long time about what the church had done. I mean, for me specifically, it would have been the horrific things that the church had done in Ireland. And I'm not going to go into that whole subject now, but I know that I also have American friends who are, recovering evangelical Christians and who are angry at what that church or those churches had them do and had them believe and had them deny themselves. And this all makes sense to me. And I mean, I remember railing against the church and shouting about it to my parents, like making my rejection of it quite violent. And in fairness to my parents, they sort of quietly nodded and smiled. And as time went on, I became less violent about it, less bitter about it, and more willing to separate the institution from the cultural side of it, I guess, and also more willing to recognize that there isn't just the kind of the establishment, kind of imperial church, but that there is also, the church of the people, and that there is also liberation theology, and that there is also, left-wing working class religion in France, or there is all of the sort of very kind of folk generated beliefs in magic and miracles, in the intercession of the saints, the cult of Our Lady as kind of many different avatars of a goddess, really, and that all of these things were, I guess, they were places that the people would put their belief in magic and wonder, the divine, the ineffable, the inexplicable, the mystery. And, their version, their kind of folk Catholicism, gave them a system in which to place these beliefs. And then, of course, it wasn't either incompatible with belief and practice of witchcraft and magic, of the fairy faith, People talk about dual observance, like the idea that one could honor and propitiate or have devotion to the Catholic pantheon, in a sense, like, you know, the Trinity, but also the Mother and also the Virgin, so they're not the same person, and also the saints, and then also other divine figures, or semi-divine, or sort of, let's say, earth divinities in a sense, local gods, fairy queens and kings, demons, angels, the devil. All of these figures were part of the tapestry of belief, and they were not mutually exclusive. And just because some of them were, I guess, antagonistic to each other, it doesn't mean that they were not part of the same thing. There was a kind of a syncretism that went on. Like it occurs to me, and I was having this conversation with some friends just today. People talking about the origins of Easter and the word Easter. And do we believe, I think it's from the Venerable Bede, Eostre is a goddess of the dawn or something in Anglo-Saxon culture, but I mean, based on just that one reference. And I was saying, I just think that it's silly looking for pagan derivations. I mean, it is absolutely sensible that the Nativity, that the miracle of the Nativity takes place at midwinter, because that is when the spark of life begins to rekindle. It is no wonder that the period of Lenten austerity comes just as they were waiting for their kind of new spring food sources to kick in, but they did break it up with Carnival to keep people happy and to kind of almost invoke the coming spring, to dance the spring into being. And, you know, when we went to our local Carnival recently, the school children and all the local villages had floats, and it was amazing. It was festive, and there was a drum ensemble and a fanfare, marching brass band, and all these floats decorated with different coloured things made of hundreds of paper flowers and people in costumes, and there was dancing and there was silliness and there was clowning, and it absolutely felt like let us dance the spring, like that these are literally the rites of spring, and so that makes sense. And then, of course, Easter makes sense. Resurrection, spring finally comes to life, and you know, and then Mary is celebrated as the May Queen, so that's another goddess aspect. And then in August, you know, the Anglo-Saxon Lammas, Loaf Mass, falls at the same time as the Irish Lunasa, where you have the first harvest, the first new bread. You know, this is not sort of rocket science. It's not even like the Christians decided to come along and steal the pagan festivals. No, they just followed the same calendar that had the obvious festivals in it. And I mean, all of, you know, you say, oh, that's just the Celtic festival or whatever. Well, yeah, but it was also probably a festival going back to the Neolithic, you know, to the very beginnings of the agricultural year. It's just kind of a simple seasonal placement of these symbolic moments of meaning, of celebration, of ceremony, of dance, of different types of food that go with different ones. It just makes sense. And you could make more of an argument, I suppose, about the placement of Christian churches on pagan shrines. But I mean, also part of what we must acknowledge is that yes, those shrines, they were probably built on that particular place because of a pre-existing propensity to sacredness of that geography, whether it be that it was at the source of a river, a spring, a pool, a riverbank, a mountain, a chasm, a cave, whatever it was. There are things that have always spoken the sacred to humans, regardless of the religion that they overlay on it. There was a fundamental mystery. And this is what brought me back again to my interrogation of Easter, because I happened to see a post by a writer, or what would you call him? Content generator? I mean, I hate that, but he makes memes, writes articles, does stuff, and his name is, well, his page is called Joking with Tolkien, like Joking spelt Jokien, Joking with Tolkien, and he does really funny stuff about J.R.R. Tolkien, and he posted this article about Easter and its connection to fairy stories, and about how Tolkien saw that. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. What's that about? And it turns out that that the writer is actually writing himself. And when I say the writer, the person who has this, he's got a Substack and he's got a Facebook page, etc. And yeah, so the address is J.R.R. Jokien, Jokien at Substack. The writer is actually writing himself from a Christian perspective, and I did not know that. But of course, so is Tolkien. And the idea that he brings up is the Tolkien idea that comes from his wonderful essay on fairy stories of the Eucatastrophe. Now, of course, we all know the word catastrophe as meaning, something terrible happening. And of course, in its original Greek derivation, it means catastrophe, so a downturn, a sudden downturn in events, when things take a plunge. But Tolkien has this concept then of the Eucatastrophe, EU being as in euphoria or euphemism, a prefix that means something good. And he's talking about the happy ending. But as he argues, in fairy stories, there isn't really an ending, so this is the sudden joyous turn. And it's a good catastrophe. And he has this lovely line saying, that it gives us a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. This is the mark of a good fairy story, that however wild its events, quoting again from Tolkien, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, having that peculiar quality. And we know what he means. It's the catch in the voice, the catch in the throat, the beat and lifting of the heart. Yes, where there are moments that have that kind of uplifting joy that brings us close to tears. And as Tolkien says, it's because they're qualitatively, that feeling is as close to joy as sorrow, because, he says, it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one, reconciled, as selfishness and altruism are lost in love. But of course, the thing that he makes explicit, this article, and you know, for example, I mean, just to go back, for me, that's the kind of feeling that you get from the scene in the Peter Jackson adaptations when Gandalf and Pippin manage to light the beacon in Gondor, and then the beacons are lit on the hilltops, and that sort of feeling of heroic endeavour, the sending of the signal across the mountains by fire, and the beautiful way it shows, you know, those guys living in their little huts, just waiting for this moment. I mean, that moves me in a strange way that is, just as he says, somewhere close to sorrow and joy at the same time. And of course, and this is what the article kind of points out, and which I guess I hadn't really thought of, is that for Tolkien, the ultimate example of this is the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus Christ at Easter. That part of the story. As he says, you know, and he says it explicitly in the essay on fairy stories, the Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful and moving, mythical in their perfect self-contained significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable Eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the Eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. And I think that had this strange impact on me, thinking about it today, because I guess, excuse me, I've got a cold. I guess when I would think back and think about the story of Easter, I would always think more about the crucifixion and the passion, and think how awful, how horrible that is what we would hold up as the thing that we hold most holy. Suffering, martyrdom, torture, a sort of a fetishization of pain, that tortured body that we see on the crucifix, bleeding from the thorns in his crown, bleeding from the nails in his palms, his feet, bleeding from the spear wound in his side, scourged, spat on, laughed at, and yet forgiving. But this is what we hold up as our Word made flesh, as our man-god. And it makes me think that it's a horrible example, because it seems like that would make a cult of suffering, and make suffering holy, and make suffering desirable. And it would feed into that thing of, you're suffering now, but you will get your reward in heaven. And it would feed into that thing of mortification of the flesh, like the physical being punished in an almost pornographic way. The body being torn apart, the body being twisted and tortured. And it just revolts me still. And I think that then that part would gain my attention still. And it would still see that as something that can and has been used as a weapon against the masses for 2,000 years, give or take, which is the idea that suffering is good for you, and the idea that suffering and forgiving those who cause you to suffer is holy. Now, certainly, it does take a certain strength of character to forgive those who cause you suffering. However, that can be a tool for those who wish to control you. If they tell you that suffering is good, if they tell you that blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit the kingdom of heaven, a scam. It's good for you to be poor. Don't you worry. We'll deal with the power and wealth. But you, the virtuous poor, you will suffer, and it will be to your credit. It is a virtue. You will suffer, and you will get your reward later. Don't you worry. But for now, we will exploit you. We will tear away from you any kind of joy and peace and harmony, and especially like a sensuous pleasure in the body, all of that. No, instead we will make your body suffer. We'll make you suffer in your poverty, in your lack, in your need, in your deprivation. But somebody's profiting from that. The church hierarchy, the state, which is bolstered and enforced by the church. And it means that, yes, religion is not just the opiate of the masses. No, it doesn't take the pain away. It turns the pain into currency. And perhaps the idea of future salvation may be a balm to the grieving heart, and it is. But so I would think about all these things. That's where my mind would go. I would think about the abuses that were perpetrated by the church, using this incredible symbolism of the holiness of suffering, the holiness of denial of the body, the holiness of repression, the holiness of pain. And that would just make me angry all over again when I thought about the pain that was inflicted by all those people who were in a position of power and chose to abuse it. And yet, and this is the point I'm coming to, is that we cannot deny, having said all that there is an incredible magical symbolism in the death and resurrection of Christ. And despite my anger, it isn't against him. It isn't against that figure, that powerful figure of love and wisdom and the miraculous, but most of all love. And I think that when I read what Tolkien is saying here, that idea of Eucatastrophe, that idea of that moment, that turn that suddenly makes you catch your breath and almost, well up with tears at the surprise and the beauty. But with the beauty, there is a sorrow. And I think that perhaps is what comes back when I think about it in another way, is how did I experience Easter as a child? How did I experience Good Friday and Easter Sunday? And I think that my imagination was such, and the education I got from my parents and my schools, etc., was such, my church, it did fire the imagination, and there was a genuine feeling of bereavement every year. Bereavement and horror at the Passion, at the death of Jesus on Good Friday, and there was a genuine feeling on Easter Sunday, especially if you went to the Easter Vigil, right, which would have been, everybody knows the midnight mass on Christmas, but the Easter Vigil is perhaps even more magical, if you believe in it, which is where, the entire church is in darkness, and it's dark outside, it's the night before, and they bring a single candle in at the back, and then they start lighting candles from it, and I think that there is no doubt that the sense of wonder of that, and by the way, I was just noting with one of my colleagues recently that that moment where the three women, I think 3 or 2 women, come to the grave and see that the stone has been pushed aside, and that the grave is empty. That, and I can't remember the name now, but the dramatization of that moment, of those who come to seek and find that he is gone, that is the basis of one of the very first scripted piece of theatre that we have in the Western canon, after the Dark Ages, or during the Dark Ages. Before that, the next thing going back is like Greek and Roman theatre. But the whole early medieval period is devoid of what we would consider scripted theatre, until that moment, which in churches they would not just read, but they would dramatize, they would play it out. The followers who come to tend to the body and find that it has disappeared. And then the idea of the resurrection, the idea of he has come back to life, and that this is possibly one of the most significant magical acts in the history of Western civilization, certainly. I think we can say world history, right? Like, that's, there have been there have been a few miracles in the history of the world that have changed the course of history. And that one, whether we believe in its historical occurrence, or whether we believe that it is a myth, or a piece of metaphor, or a piece of propaganda, like whatever we believe, doesn't matter, in the sense that the story of that, he died and was buried, and on the third day he rose again in accordance with the scriptures, and his, what is it, and his kingdom will come, and it will have no end, or something like that. Anyway, yes, I mean, the words are still there in my head. That's why I think those words are probably from the Apostles' Creed or something. But yeah, so, oh God, I should really make sure I have... sorry. Anyway, and all of this brought me back to thinking about one of my favourite poets, and that is Gerard Manley Hopkins. Now, Hopkins was an incredible poet in a number of different ways, in fact, because he was ahead of his time. He wrote at the end of the 19th century. And he was ahead of his time because his poetry was actually, in its use of rhythm and its use of language and its use of neologism, but also its use of sort of Anglo-Saxon word stress patterns, the Welsh consonant chiming method known, I believe, as Kuhanath, if I'm saying that right. His use of sort of medieval philosophy, and anyway, his form was incredible, to the point where a lot of people didn't really understand what it was he was trying to do, and his subject, in a large part, he is a nature poet and he is a religious poet. He was a priest himself. He was a Catholic priest. He suffered desperately from depression and doubt. He wrote one series that are known as the Terrible Sonnets, which are all about losing one's faith, and not just one's faith in God, but one's faith in life, in oneself. You know, I still know parts of some of them off by heart. You know, just remember lines like, what black hours we have spent, what sights you heart saw, ways you went, and more must in yet longer lights delay. He expresses the truth of despair in a way that I think very few other poets ever have, and that is despite his faith, because he asks, you know, in those moments, he asks God, you know, basically, why have you forsaken me? Much as Jesus on the cross did. And then he also writes the most incredible evocations of not just the beauty of nature, but of its nature, of its actual thisness, which is, you know, he refers to that himself using the language that he borrows from the philosopher John Duns Scotus, the word Eucatastrophe, which means thisness, thingness, the being in itselfness. We might add to that. He tries to capture what the essence of things and experiences is particularly sensory experience. And in doing so, he uses language in a way that is just stunning. And it occurred to me that there is a poem that ties these things together. And I myself, I think, adhere in almost every particular to his attitude to the natural world, and his attitude to language even, but do not believe in God the way he does. And yet, maybe I do. So he writes here, and this is about what this show is about, what this particular episode of the podcast is about, in a poem that is called "That Nature is a Heraclitean Fire, and of the Comfort of the Resurrection." So Heraclitean being Heraclitus, who talked about that idea of everything being in a constant cycle. Nothing, kind of a bit like, energy cannot be created or destroyed, right? Laws of thermodynamics. Heraclitus said that everything is this constantly changing fire, but that is constantly cycling, all matter, all being, all existence. So Hopkins is saying nature is a Heraclitean fire, and it's a lot for a title, and of the comfort of the resurrection. And he's talking about obviously the resurrection of Jesus, but the way he's talking about it. Well, I'm going to try to read it. Hopkins isn't always easy to read, both because of the language, with its sort of patterns of alliteration, long lines, enjambment onto the next, etc. A bit of a tongue twister, and also sometimes because I just find it emotional. So, let me see if I can manage. That Nature is a Heraclitean Fire, and of the Comfort of the Resurrection, by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Cloud puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows flaunt forth, then chevy on an air-built thoroughfare. Heaven roisterers in gay gangs they throng, they glitter in marches. Down roughcast, down dazzling whitewash, wherever an ale marches, shivelites and shadow tackle in long lashes, lace, lance and pear. Delightfully the bright wind boisterous ropes, wrestles, beats earth bare of yester tempest's creases. In pool and rut peel parches squandering ooze to squeezed dough, crust, dust, stanches, starches, squadroned masks and man-marks, treadmire toil there, foot-fretted in it. Million-fueled nature's bonfire burns on, but quench her bonniest, dearest to her clearest salvage spark, man, how fast his fire-dint, his mark on mind is gone. Both are in an unfathomable, all is in an enormous dark ground. O pity and indignation, man-shape, that shone sheer off, disseveral, a star. Death blots black out. Nor mark is any of him at all so stark, but vastness blurs and time beats level. Enough! The resurrection! A heart's clarion. Away! Grief's gasping, joyless days, dejection, across my foundering deck shone a beacon, an eternal beam. Flesh fade and mortal trash fall to the residuary worm. World's wildfire leave but ash. In a flash, at a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. And this Jack, joke, poor potsherd, patch, matchwood, immortal diamond, is immortal diamond. See, I find that hard to read. Not just because it's so complicated, which it is, but also because I think that it brings to me exactly that feeling that Tolkien is talking about, that feeling of Eucatastrophe, that feeling of, let me see if I can see it, yeah, the peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy. And so, of course, we mean, successful poetry, magic. The peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is a brief vision that the answer may be greater. It may be a far-off gleam or echo of Evangelion in the real world. The use of this word gives a hint of my epilogue. It is a serious and dangerous matter. It is presumptuous of me to touch upon such a theme. But if, by grace, what I say has in any respect any validity, it is, of course, only one facet of a truth incalculably rich, finite only because the capacity of man for whom this was done is finite. It is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or adult that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, having a peculiar quality. Yeah. And I think that that feeling, Hopkins, in his poem, and in a lot of his poetry, produces that in me, and I think that it is, for me, the mark of true poetry, and, I must say, it is the mark of wonder and of enchantment and of magic, to me, is that it produces that catch in the throat, that leap of the heart. And what Hopkins seems to me to say in this incredible poem is that the first, I think that if I were to count the lines, I would probably find that it is a sonnet. I'm not going to bother because they're too complicated. But it looks like in the first part, he has shown that vast movement of the world, from the clouds to the trees to the wind to the dirt, million-fueled nature's bonfire burns on. And it's an absolute tour de force, those first lines, in their sound, in their sound and the way the sound conveys the movement and the change from state to state. Absolutely incredible. But quench her bonniest, dearest to her, her clearest selvage spark, man. That, we, of all those changing things, are the clearest selvage, the clearest selfed creature. Spark. I mean, it's just amazing. And the idea that we, and that spark of ours is drowned in infinite darkness, because yes, it is. Death blots black out, nor mark is any of him at all so stark, but vastness blurs and time beats level. There is not a single mark that any of us can leave that will not be erased by time and vastness. And then incredible sort of caesura in the middle of the line. Enough! The resurrection. A heart's clarion. Now, you may not, as I may not, believe in that resurrection as our salvation. But just the idea of there being something eternal. The idea of there being something eternal. Away grief's grasping joyous days dejection. Across my foundering deck shone a beacon, an eternal beam. The deck of the ship, and the beacon, the lighthouse, an eternal beam. Flesh fade, and mortal trash fall to the residuary worm. Worlds, wildfire, leave but ash. In a flash at a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. And so, that idea that is, it doesn't matter what, who Christ is. What he is here is just the very idea that there is an immortal part to us. I think that's all we need. And he says, but for him, for Hopkins, it makes a difference. I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. That the immortal part of us, the spark of the divine, was once expressed as human, as man. And this jack joke, poor potsherd patch, matchwood, immortal diamond, is immortal diamond. And so, it pleases me to think that today, regardless of whether we believe, practice, or have anything to do with Christianity whatsoever, it is still a day where we could say to ourselves, well, let us contemplate that mystery. The mystery of the absolute inevitability of death and complete annihilation of everything we are and made and did. Complete. And yet, perhaps we can still believe that there is something immortal in us, and we can believe that that which is immortal in us was once, and still is, expressed in our human bodies, that can suffer, that can die, as it is expressed in the constant burning flow of all nature around us. And that this solemn mystery is not just for a particular imperial cult and hierarchy and institution that once imposed its will upon half the world. No. It is also for everyone. The idea that within this flawed, failing, dying animal that we are, this husk of matter, there is also the spark of the divine, that they are indivisible, because all nature is a constant Heraclitean fire, shifting from one form to another, shifting from the sky to the trees, to the earth, to the river, and that we are of it, and in it, and it is in us, and that all of that thought is the immortal diamond, which is the